This lecture is American Slavery, the Origins of Slavery from 1492. We start off with the image of Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. In it, he talks about his experience being kidnapped in Africa, his survival across the Middle Passage, being sold into slavery in the British colonies, and then eventually getting his freedom and learning to read and write and publishing his autobiography. So this is a rich source for historians to understand the experiences of early slavery. Starting with the Atlantic's trade, we see a series of triangular trade routes that crisscrossed the Atlantic that was hugely profitable, in large part because of the slave trade. Between 1492 and 1820, 7.7 million Africans were brought to the New World. Colonial merchants profited highly from the slave trade, even in areas where slavery was a minor institution. And it really stimulated the New World's economy. One historian said, quote, "The growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor," end quote. So America was built on slave labor. With the exception of a few, most African rulers took part in the slave trade, gaining guns and textiles in exchange for their slaves. The slave trade was concentrated in Western Africa and greatly disrupted its society and economy. Often, African rulers would send expeditions to neighboring villages, kidnap slaves, bring them back to the coast, and there they would be traded and sold, and there they would await their voyage to the New World. The Middle Passage was the voyage that slaves took across the Atlantic from Africa. Slaves were crammed aboard ships for maximum profit, and roughly 1 in 5 died on this voyage. The slave traders took a vast majority of the slaves to Brazil and the West Indies, where they worked on sugar plantations. This labor was very arduous and had a high mortality rate. Less than 5% of the slaves were actually taken to what becomes the United States. You can see from this map here, 32% of slaves went to the Portuguese Empire, followed by 24 to the British Caribbean, 17 to the French Caribbean, 13 to the Spanish colonies, 7% to the Dutch colonies, and just 4% to the British colonies. So even though there was not a huge population of Africans that were transported to the British colonies, through natural reproduction, the slave population there increased. And by 1770, 1/5 of the population in the colonies were African or part African. American slavery before 1680. Indentured servants were brought to Jamestown when it was founded in 1607 and steadily provided the main source of labor on the Chesapeake and southern plantations. So 2/3 of all white immigrants who came to the British colonies were indentured servants. And these were people that either were seeking passage to the Americas, and in compensation for that passage would give a portion of their life, up to 7 years or so, as a servant in exchange for their freedom after that contracted time. They were given no compensation, but it was a temporary status. they would eventually be able to gain their freedom and have their own land and so forth. So this was the preferred form of labor prior to 1680. It was familiar. They spoke the same language. It was plentiful. A lot of Englishmen and some English women were desperate to get out of Britain and hope and an attempt for a better life in the New World. America equaled land, and for people who were landless in Britain, land equated wealth and power. And so the hope for land ownership was always what was being sought. Slavery first was introduced into Jamestown in the Chesapeake in 1619. In the early years, slavery was considered to be very fluid. And what we mean by fluid is there weren't strict codes or laws around slavery. Many slaves would eventually be able to buy or earn their freedom. A lot of masters in their wills would stipulate that upon their death, their slaves would be freed. And so you see, Black men owning land, sometimes owning their own slaves, and there was a lot of flexibility in some ways in the early years of American slavery. The transition to permanent slavery happened starting really in the 1660s. The Virginia Slave Law of 1662 stated that the status of a mother determined the status of a child. So therefore, if an enslaved woman had a child, that child would inherit the enslaved status of their mother. And we see that this leads to some forms of incentive to have sex, or in some cases rape, often slave women by white masters, because it would, in theory, increase their quote unquote property. And at this time, slaves were considered to be property. We also see in 1672 the Royal African Company come to drive the cost of slaves down. The slave prices decreased and became more available in part by the creation of the Royal African Company. We also see around this time less white indentured servants coming to the Americas as conditions and there was more stability throughout the British Empire. And lastly, another reason for this transition was Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where you see a temporary merging of landless whites and African slaves and white indentured servants trying to come together for greater rights. And what ends up happening is more rights are increased for white men, leading to a greater distinction between white and black, where white becomes synonymous with freedom and black becomes more synonymous with enslavement. All right, looking at slavery in the South, we see three distinct slave systems. In the North, these are considered non-plantation societies like New England and the Middle Colonies, where slavery is few and far between. In South Carolina and Georgia, in the Deep South, where there is rice plantations, this is where slavery is more entrenched. It's considered to be a slave society, meaning slavery is dependent on the economy, and the economy is dependent on slavery. And then we have the Chesapeake, where this is kind of what we would consider to be the Middle Atlantic and sort of the Virginian colonies where tobacco plantations were highly profitable. So Chesapeake's slavery was based on tobacco. After 1680, we talked about labor switching from indentured servitude to slavery. And slavery really transforms Chesapeake society into an elaborate hierarchy of degrees of freedom. At the top of this hierarchy were the large planters, who were the elite. They dominated society and trade. They were highly influential in politics, made the laws. They dominated both politically and economically. And these people would own large plantations and own, sometimes hundreds of slaves. Below that, you have the Yemen farmers, who were the small landowners. Maybe they had slaves, but maybe not. And if they did, it would be, maybe a handful of slaves to help them out with their family farm. Just below that were the indentured servants and tenant farmers. These are the non-landowners who would work for larger planters, maybe rent out a portion of their land in exchange for their work on the large plantations, or overseeing sometimes the slaves. And then at the very bottom of this hierarchy were slaves. They were not free. They were not entitled to any rights. And therefore, they allowed for these non-land-owning whites to have some status. And we see this kind of hierarchy stay dominant even throughout the end of the Civil War into the 20th century in the Jim Crow South. Freedom and slavery in the Chesapeake. Planters enacted laws to protect their power over slaves as slavery became more entrenched. And race becomes more important as a line of social division, and free blacks start to lose rights as free, and free and white become virtually identical. So some free blacks lost their right to vote, to own a gun, and at one point Virginia enacts a law that requires free slaves to leave the colony altogether. Slavery in the Deep South looked a little bit different. We see large-scale rice cultivation here in what was known as the Rice Kingdom, so thinking of the Carolinas and Georgia. And here, slaves used a task system. The slave masters gave them essentially a to-do list each day or each week of what tasks they needed to get done. When those tasks were completed, they had time for their own leisure or to cultivate their own crops, to spend more time socializing and so forth. So the task system in the Deep South allowed for greater autonomy and freedom, so to speak. Unlike the gang system, which the Chesapeake used, the gang system on the tobacco farms were continuous work at the same pace every day, with the work of an overseer to keep them in line and punish anyone if they stepped out of line. In South Carolina, by 1770, the number of slaves had reached 100,000, which was well over half the colony's population. So this becomes the colony with the first black majority, where slaves outnumbered free whites. And this is important because we see that the slaves had an active rather than passive role in shaping the colony. Slaves that were imported from West Africa brought with them skills that made them quite valuable to the colony. Their knowledge of the coastal and waterways made them skilled fishermen. They were familiar with rice cultivation, and they had just strong immunities to malarious climates, which was one of the things that led to high mortality rates in the Chesapeake in Jamestown in the early years. So this just gave them a greater ability to adapt and thrive and actually have some power and some influence in the formation of the colonial culture. So next we're going to look at slavery in the middle and northern colonies. Slavery in the North is considered to be fewer and farther between. There were slaves here and there, but there was no large-scale plant cultivation like we see in the South. The northern geography and land was just more rocky and more suited for small-scale farms, family farms, rather than large-scale crop production that like we see in the South. And so this is what historians see as a society with slaves, right? Which means, yes, there is slavery, but it's not integral to the economy, right? It's not the basis of the economy. Some people, some of the elite might have slaves working in their homes, as cooks, as nurses or nannies, but it's very fewer and farther between. Also, the labor was much more skilled in the North, so a lot of the slaves that were working may be working along in the lumber yards or the shipbuilding arenas. So they would have much more skilled areas of work, unlike that of the South. Slavery in the middle colonies was a little bit more split. You tend to see the coastal regions follow more in line with what slavery looked like in the North, but in the more rural eastern areas of the middle colonies, you see it look a little bit more similar to that of the South, where you see larger scale farming and slavery might be more integral to some of those economies. Becoming African American. Slavery is the common link among Africans in America. It's not kinship, it's not language, it's not even race, it's slavery itself. For most of the 1700s or the 18th century, the majority of American slaves were African by birth, right? They were born in Africa. And so there was a lot of differences. Most of the slaves on a large plantation would have really nothing in common other than the fact that they were enslaved. Religion comes to form a little bit more slowly in colonial America. We see a lot of attempts to indoctrinate slaves with Christianity, and this transition from traditional African religions to Christianity was difficult. West African religions varied quite a bit, but they shared a belief in spiritual forces in nature, somewhat similar to what we see with Native American religions. And so what we see is that slaves kind of over time adapted Christian religious practices, but melded it with some of their traditional beliefs to make their own fusion, right? They adopted it to suit their needs and their beliefs. In the Chesapeake, slaves learned English. They participated in the Great Awakening. They were exposed to white culture. But what we see in the Deep South in South Carolina and Georgia was a very different Black society emerge, right? There was greater retainment of African cultural elements in their housing styles, in their child naming practices and language. They had less contact with whites, and so there was a greater Black culture that developed that was more influenced by West Africa. And as we talked about, they had more autonomy, when compared to slaves from other economies. Slaves in the cities, like in Charleston and Savannah, assimilated more quickly into Euro-American culture. And in the North, a distinct African-American culture developed much more slowly. Looking at race and racism, in 1968, the historian Winthrop Jordan wrote a book called White Over Black, and I'm including an excerpt for you in the module. But in it, he's exploring this historical debate, whether slavery emerged out of racism or vice versa. And Jordan sees them as equally and mutually causal. Winthrop Jordan traces the pit of judgment to Elizabethan language, where Black was loaded with negative connotations, and kind of sees that as leading to them as being consequently fit for servitude. He says that in 1619 to 1680, Blacks became regarded differently from white laborers, and in part because of these negative pejoratives from the Elizabethan times. He also makes an interesting argument. He sees that slavery was a means of reducing white men's fears of their own sexual aggressiveness by projecting it onto Black slaves. And this kind of goes in line with what we see from the mixed race children that we see largely on the plantation, right? This would kind of go in line with that, with his argument there. So I'll be curious to see what you all think of this piece and really trying to trace the origins of racism. All right, lastly, looking at slave codes and slave resistance. The Black population really started to grow by the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And despite enslavement, Blacks early on in this pioneering period had some freedom and autonomy, as we've talked about. But as the Black population increased, you see greater fear and anxiety among whites, leading to stricter slave codes and more provisions that ended up leading to greater insurrections. So it's sort of this domino effect. As fear and anxiety among whites grows, stricter codes and laws are passed, leading to a greater desire to rebel and resist from the slaves. And what historians know is that between 1739 and 1741, a series of rebellions and insurrections, including the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, which led to the killing of about 20 whites and led to the track down and hanging of the rebel slaves in South Carolina. All of this led to just a tightening of slave codes. So going in to the 19th century, into the 1800s, slavery as an institution becomes much different, much more organized, controlled, institutionalized than it had been any time prior. Thank you.